We are moving ever closer to the conclusion of, would you say that this is the United States' first great ghost story? Maybe, I'm not 100% sure. We're moving closer, however, to the end of that story, and I'm not 100% sure how this is going to work out in so quick a fashion, but it must. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we're here for another discussion along the road of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This is a video that will appear in two different playlists here on the channel. Number one being the Sleepy Hollow read-along playlist here on the channel. This is episode 5 of that, but also the Classic Haunts playlist here on the channel, a playlist of videos that premiered in the month of October 2025, leading up to Halloween 2025. This video will have 3 different parts: a So What Happened recap of the short story, a literary criticism section where we talk about some of the literary ideas going on in this story, and finally a writer's corner where I have but one note. However, it is a note that I had never quite thought about in this way. So, what happened? Well, at the gathering, Mr. Van Tassel encourages everyone to have a good time, and Ichabod, who is a good dancer, even gets to dance with Katrina, and makes a point of impressing while Brom watches. Then Van Tassel and company tell tales of yore, including tales of war, but especially tales of the Headless Horseman patrolling the surrounding darkness. And wouldn't you know it, old Brom has a story about the Headless Horseman himself. He met the Headless Horseman on the high roads one time and challenged him to a race for some punch, don't you know? And he would have won, too, had the horseman not vanished into flame. At this point, I think, with Brom telling this story, we are left to wonder whether or not there is any Headless Horseman. Is this just a figment of the town's imagination, and for blowhards like Brom Bones to continue to blow their own Brom Bones and make themselves look better? Then Ichabod adds tales of witches, courtesy Cotton Mather, of course. So, the literary goings-on in this portion of the short story. We have a very interesting quote here that is, I think, a quote that makes you sort of reconceptualize ghosts in general. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of this kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintances left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts, except in our long-established Dutch communities. Well, how long does someone have to be dead to legally become a ghost, right? But this does bring up the specter, if you will, of the United States at this time being a young country. A very young country. A country that would not look at all the way that we know it today. But it's also interesting that this idea of impermanence. So the person dies, and before they can manifest themselves as a ghost, all the people they knew in life had already moved on to a different part of this new country. Right? That impermanence of the United States. And that's what makes it so hard for them to go on and haunt. They can't even build a reputation as a ghost because all the people they used to know have carried on. Well, that doesn't stop the Headless Horseman now, does it? So we have a little bit of talking out of both sides of the mouth here from our author, but it is an interesting thing to think about nonetheless. How does this idea of haunting work? How does it really work? Do you have to get a license for it? Does it take 7 years to Does it take 7 years to get into the ranks the way you have to wait 7 years after retiring from football that you might enter the Hall of Fame? Is it only Hall of Fame level spirits that get to come back and haunt? What are the mechanics of this idea of haunting? It is something interesting to think about, and it's also interesting to think about the country had been so young that scarcely a generation of people had passed on by the time this story was being written. So, again, very interesting, and we'll get back to this a little bit later, but very interesting to put a sort of date on things, a time stamp. Now, the second thing worth considering in this part of the story, and this is something that I think is going to play heavily into the review once I get to the review of this story, the feast. We have a celebration. Is this Cinderella? Is this story a take on Cinderella? We have the nobody that shows up to the ball in order to get the eye of someone special. I don't know yet, but there is this idea of the feast before the battle, the feast before the horror, all of these sort of things. So it feels like we're in that part of the story here. The last thing I want to talk about isn't necessarily literary criticism so much as it is something that I fear. Not ghost stories themselves. But what happens here is the people get together, they eat, they dance, and then there is a great storytelling. Everyone gathers around to tell stories. Everyone stands around and listens to other people telling the stories. Have we lost the art of storytelling? If you go to a gathering like this today, does it end in people telling stories? Or does it end in exhibiting YouTube videos and watching movies or just turning on the television? Have we lost this ability to tell stories in this way, tell stories that would pass on knowledge, pass on wisdom, that would bind us to each other, bind us to this land, bind us to a shared culture, a national identity, a regional identity? We have lost all of those things, haven't we? We do not do this anymore, do we? There is no storytelling in these gatherings, is there? I don't suppose that there is anything innately good about storytelling. I'm in favor of it, of course. I'm here. I've been here for 10 years now doing this. But I don't suppose that there is anything that has to be in the human experience with storytelling in the way that it is happening in this story. Aren't YouTube videos storytelling? Aren't movies storytelling? Isn't the local coverage of events wisdom sharing? Well, maybe not. But there is something to be said for a more personalized take on this, right? So you have, I don't know, you have whatever YouTuber you like. He's probably good at talking. She's probably very good at communicating ideas. Better than your Uncle Larry, right? So aren't you better off for listening to this well-spoken YouTuber as opposed to weird Uncle Larry? Aren't you better off listening to some well-traveled news person, investigative journalist, rather than your Aunt Sally complaining about work? Maybe. But maybe there is something more personal that we lose instead of this. And then in the writer's corner here, the one note that I have, dating a story or grounding it. This is a very interesting thing that started to occur to me in this portion of this short story. I think that it is perhaps more important than I had previously placed on it to be cognizant of the peculiarities of your time. We have all sorts of peculiarities of the time implanted in this short story with impunity. How young the country is, and the sort of idea that there were groupings of immigrants. So you have a Dutch sort of settlement here. You have a Brit or a German, whatever it is that Ichabod Crane is actually, who is staying in the area, but he's still an outsider, right? That is something that is at least fairly peculiar to this time, in its abundance at least. All of these things about, for example, the schoolhouse, right? Ichabod Crane isn't a teacher, he's a businessman. He has to run the school. These ideas that there are still kind of royalty in this country at this time. The Van Tassels are kind of a higher station in life than our dear old Ichabod, and Ichabod feels it, right? Being cognizant of these peculiarities of your time might seem as if it were time stamping or dating your story in a bad way. But is it really? Because I think that it gives your reader something interesting to contemplate while they are reading. For example, what we've talked about several times with how young the country is at this point in time, and here we have Irving talking about how there are rarely even the ghosts with the gusto to haunt because everything is still so new. So it seems as if perhaps it is dating your story. Perhaps it is making your story something that will be passed over in the future. But I think that what happens is writing these observations ironically makes your story timeless because there are those talking points, but also because there is something of that which carries on. So one of the stories that I am reading concurrently with this is The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. And one of the things that keeps rising up in that story is the idea of impermanence. Everything around these characters is changing. And here they are out in the woods, and everything is changing around them, evolving rapidly because of a flood coming to ruin everything. There was a general paranoia at his time when he was writing this. I think the short story was published in 1902. So you're looking at someone who, in Algernon Blackwood, was born in 1869. You're looking at someone who was experiencing the Industrial Revolution. That paranoia of everything changing around them as they were living in what was once the wilderness and is now a fluid and moving state is something peculiar to his time. It is something interesting to Algernon Blackwood. Now, whether or not he intentionally infused that to his short story, I don't know, but it seems to me that it is there. So this idea of taking the sort of zeitgeist of the day and putting it in your story, I think is not something that actually degrades the story or degrades your writing. But I think it gives it some type of tangible cloth that can be very fulfilling to a reader, because we can read that today of Algernon Blackwood's story and say, you extrapolate the paranoia about change and you can just sort of dump it on something else, make it personal, and all of a sudden that short story becomes about something other than the Industrial Revolution to you. It becomes personal. I have always been afraid or paranoid about X, Y, and Z. So you get to implant it in your psyche as well. That is all I have for this video. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on the channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.